Ahoy, and welcome. This is Admiral.
Wololo.
The Jurchins are among the most anticipated of the new DLC's offerings, and personally the one I find most appealing. This long-awaited civilization has been the subject of many fan concepts, some of them going back quite a few years. Nearly all such concepts make reference to the famous Tiefutu or Iron Pagoda cavalry, redoubtable Jin cavalrymen covered in heavy armor like cataphracts, and known for their powerful charges and personal valor that impressed even the mighty Mongol hordes. So today we're going to look at the AoE 2 interpretation of that unit in terms of performance and gameplay, as well as a brief and subjective conceptual critique of how well the unit is patterned after its historical inspiration and fan expectations. The Iron Pagoda is a castle-produced unique unit that basically serves as a knight replacement with a few extra benefits and trade-offs, as the Jurchins don't have access either to the knight line or the new Heiguang knight variant, despite being a cavalry civilization. So Iron Pagodas are your only choice of heavy cavalry with the Jurchins, so let's see how they stack up against knights from other civilizations. In terms of stats, the Iron Pagoda has 15 more hit points, 2 more melee attack, a bit more speed, 1 more line of sight, and perhaps most importantly, 1 more pierce armor, although it does trade that for 1 less melee armor than the knight. So far it seems to be a decent portrayal of the robust Jin cataphracts, with a couple trade-offs. For whatever reason, it also has a slow baseline attack rate that's offset just enough to negate the civilization bonus, after which it attacks as quickly as a paladin, or other unique cavalry units like the Latus or Boyar, but slightly slower than a knight or cavalier. Of course, this is partly made up by their increased attack, but design-wise, it does feel strange to have a civilization bonus for faster attacking cavalry, only to miss Knightline, and to have that bonus neutralized for their unique cavalry unit. The Iron Pagoda's unique ability is the capacity to completely block or parry damage from the first non-projectile attack that otherwise would have wounded it. Note that I say non-projectile as opposed to melee attack, as units with a ranged melee attack, such as Mangonel Line, Throwing Axemen, or Gabedos, will not be blocked by the Iron Pagoda. It's also important to note that non-projectile blast or trample damage does deplete the charge, so against such units you won't always get the full protection of shrugging off a direct hit. However, as a consequence of applying to non-projectile attacks, this ability allows the Iron Pagoda to be shielded from the first attack even from demolition units. So if your strategy is to send forth the flaming camels, that can work, but you will have to sacrifice a few just to take down the shields. So up to now, the unit is mostly looking like a better version of the knight, which at least you would expect given the castle bottleneck. They do cost the same amount of total resources as the knight line, although with 20 of those resources moved from gold to food, making them harder to produce in Castle Age, but easier on your war chest in late game. Their training time is just under half the time of Knightline at 14 seconds versus 30, or a little better than 2 stables producing knights. Versus equal resources worth of generic knights, they soundly trounce the competition, although they can actually have trouble against powerful knight civilizations, like Lithuanians with 3 relics, Bulgarians after stirrups, or against discounted Berber knights, which is a close fight, but one that the Iron Pagoda usually loses by a hair. This isn't the only relevant matchup, but I do think it's an important strike against the unit, given that it seems intended as a better but less accessible knight, but that knights can be massed sooner, and even a few extra generic knights can tip the scale to victory. For example, in the Berber scenario, the 15% Castle Age discount provided for just 4 more knights, or 28 knights for 24 resources worth of Iron Pagodas. Realistically, I'd expect that even a totally generic knight civilization would often be able to eke out a numbers advantage given the lower food cost and earlier availability of knights, and all the more so for civilizations with powerful economic bonuses or stronger knights. So thus far, I'm not too impressed with the Iron Pagoda given its constraints. Their damage blocking ability will be most effective against units with a slow but high attack, including bonus damage dealing units like pikemen. Between their extra hit points and block ability, they can take 7 hits from a pikeman versus a knight's 5, so they definitely fare better than knights in that situation, but it's still a pretty rough matchup for the Iron Pagodas and doesn't rise nearly to the cataphract's level of being a mutual counter. The Iron Pagoda's block or parry ability deflects 25 damage from a pikeman with all Castle Age upgrades, or if for the sake of comparison we translate that advantage to hit points instead of the block ability, it's like the Pagoda having 160 hit points versus pikemen. whereas a Cataphract's extra armor and bonus damage resistance absorbs 26 damage after being hit twice by that same pikeman, or 117 damage over the life of the Cataphract if it's only being attacked by pikemen, which is comparable to the Cataphract having 227 hit points versus pikemen. And that doesn't even account for the Cataphract's anti-infantry bonus, which allows it to kill the pikemen sooner. Admittedly, this is a bit of an apples and oranges comparison as the units don't quite fill the same role, and the Iron Pagoda's block is relevant against all non-projectile attacks, whereas the Cataphract's bonus resistance is only relevant against Spearline, Camels, Eagle Warriors, and Genoese crossbowmen. But it does show that even what is arguably the best use case of the Iron Pagoda's block ability falls far short of a similar but more specialized type of ability in the Cataphract's bonus damage resistance. So I think it's safe to say that outside of explosive encounters, the block ability itself is pretty weak, especially given that it takes a full minute to recharge or 50 seconds for the Elite Iron Pagoda, and can be exhausted by the smallest non-ranged attack, including trample damage. And of course, this ability is totally irrelevant when it comes to projectiles. But speaking of projectiles, and providing significant redemption for the unit in Castle Age, the Iron Pagoda does have one additional pierce armor over a knight, as we talked about, which is likely to do far more of the heavy lifting than any other attribute or ability in terms of making it viable at that stage. It only takes 2 damage per shot from a Bodkin arrow crossbowman versus a knight's 3, or 68 shots to kill versus 44 knight. On top of its slightly improved speed, this makes it a very solid archer counter as long as the army sizes aren't too lopsided, although Jurchins do also have fully upgraded elite skirmishers, and excellent siege units including rocket carts as archer counters. Moving into the Imperial Age, the Elite Iron Pagoda upgrade costs nearly the price of Imperial Age itself at 950 food and 750 gold, although that is in line with other unique cavalry upgrade costs, and cheaper than the Paladin upgrade. The upgrade adds 25 hit points, 1 attack and melee armor, and a slightly faster recharge time for their block ability. Their best selling points at this stage are still their relatively high pierce armor, better than a generic Cavalier and equal to a generic Paladin at 7 after all upgrades, their lower gold cost, and their ability to tank additional damage from Halberdiers. Whereas a generic Cavalier will die in 4 hits from a Halberdier, and a generic Paladin in 5, the Elite Iron Pagoda with a full charge is tied with the Sicilian Cavalier in being able to tank 6 hits from a Halberdier, although they do require 1 more hit than a Paladin to kill a fully armored Halberdier. However, barring explosive exceptions, that is their high watermark as far as performance, and even a generic Paladin with no bonuses is a better generalist, although of course the princely sum of the Paladin's upgrade cost can be prohibitive. But if you can afford it, even a generic Paladin is better in almost any other matchup versus equal resources worth of enemies than an Elite Iron Pagoda, as the 20 extra hit points offers more protection in a far greater variety of situations than the block ability, on top of higher attack for the Paladin, and all the more so for powerful Paladins and Savars. Even a lot of the Super Cavaliers are better melee generalists, with Bulgarian and Malian Cavaliers typically beating equal resources worth of Elite Iron Pagodas, and even the discounted but otherwise generic Berber Cavaliers will usually win an equal resource contest. Sicilian Cavaliers don't win head-to-head, but they have a very similar proficiency profile of performing better versus Spearline units, while also having even more impressive pierce armor after their unique technology. Now obviously the purpose of a unique unit is to perform a role effectively for a given civilization, and not necessarily to win the Cavalympics against similar units from other civilizations. And the Iron Pagoda does fill the role as a passable and somewhat gold-efficient heavy cavalry unit for the Jurchins, especially when the extra pierce armor over a knight or cavalier is needed. From the reference point of knight civilizations, the Iron Pagoda feels like a knight replacement that is significantly better against crossbowmen, and moderately better in melee, but as we discussed before, not necessarily enough to make up for its lesser accessibility, especially against strong knight civilizations. In Imperial Age, it feels too much like a strong cavalier or side grade of a paladin that is trained at the castle, and as such is not terribly interesting on its own merits, so much is due to having no competition from the missing knight line, which I don't think quite does justice to its historical inspiration. Within the Jurchen civilization, it feels like a situationally useful, but kind of uninspired unit that's crowded out by some of the other Jurchen units and bonuses. My guess is that players will get more mileage out of their faster attacking Scout and Step Lancer line, which are available much sooner and can still be used to raid and pick off smaller groups of archers. or from their plethora of powerful and accessible ranged options, from grenadiers and siege to even their inaccurate but faster firing cavalry archers. Although I suppose that the unit works within the framework of the civilization, and transitioning into Iron Pagodas in an extended castle age can make sense, especially against archer civilizations, and in the late game as your most population and gold efficient heavy cavalry unit. But I have to admit I'm a bit disappointed that it will almost certainly play a lesser role than in most civilization concepts I've seen. It just doesn't quite seem to embody the pinnacle of East Asian heavy cavalry that I and others had identified it with. So overall, and wrapping up with a brief conceptual discussion, it feels like a functional unit design, but one that doesn't really stand out either in terms of power or flavor, although the visual does go a long way, and even a small stat tweak could do a lot to make it more powerful. Frankly, I was expecting a more epic ability and larger role for this iconic unit, as a block or parry gimmick could reasonably be given to almost any unit with a sword, shield, or armor. To give the Iron Pagoda a brief shoot-from-the-hip rating, I'd give it 9 out of 10 for its graphics, 6 out of 10 for usefulness, and 4 out of 10 for mechanics and design. Outside of countering crossbowmen and Castle Age, the unit is less interesting than I'd hoped for, and while the parry or block ability adds some flavor while being thematically acceptable, I do think that a more powerful and fitting ability could have been chosen to reflect their impressive armor and effective charges. Not that it ought to be just a stronger paladin, but that it should distinguish itself more positively from the sea of existing cavalry unique units and boosted cavaliers or paladins. While the new samurai features a speed increasing charge, as covered in another video, we have yet to see a cavalry unit with that ability, despite the obvious logic of a cavalry charge. So the Iron Pagoda could have been a Manchurian candidate either for a speed charge, or as the first cavalry unit to have trample damage without needing a unique technology. Or if we wanted to lean into the heavy armor, and perhaps add flavor to the existing block feature, the unit might be immune or resistant to charge attacks, or to armor ignoring and armor destroying attacks. I was a little disappointed to learn that while the Iron Pagoda blocks the first attack of a Urumi swordsman, Courtier, or Roman unique unit after their unique technology, the charge damage patiently waits its turn and gets applied in full to the next attack. So using a limited parry mechanic as an abstraction of high armor wouldn't have been my first choice, although it's a tolerable abstraction in general, and especially relative to some of the other design choices of this DLC, but I digress. I won't be surprised if the unit gets at least a mild boost in the future, perhaps a lower recharge time, a bit more attack or faster attack rate, or something else, but that remains to be seen. So those are my thoughts about the Iron Pagoda, but what do you think? Do you agree that the performance or design feels a little bland? Or can you see this unit being a powerful unit in the right situations, and even appreciate the unorthodox unit design within the Jurchen civilization? As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts. That's all for today, and thanks for watching. This has been me illustrating points on the insipid performance of the initial parry, yet interesting potential of the in-game portrayal of the iconic powerhouse that was the Iron Pagoda. Till next time.